Now, I'd like to introduce Alex Pfeiffer, who will be giving today's presentation. As I mentioned previously, Alex is at the Institute of New Economic Thinking, but he is also a DPhil student in the School of Geography and the Environment. And I believe your background is stranded carbon risk and the impact on financial markets. That be correct?
That's correct, yes.
Great. So I'll hand the floor over to Alex now.
So, hello everybody. First of all, welcome to you, and thank you for dialing in and logging in and attending this talk. I'm very honored to be able to present my research here. And yes, Daniel already mentioned, I'm going to present my latest paper, which is called The 2-Degree Capital Stock for Electricity Generation. We have been writing this together with Richard Miller, who is here in Oxford at the Department of Physics, with Cameron Hepburn, who is my PhD supervisor and at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and Eric Beinhocker, who is the director of the Institute of New Economic Thinking. And I want to basically, well, first of all, I want to mention that this has been published in the journal Applied Energy, and it's also available online as a working paper on the website of the INET, of the Institute of New Economic Thinking, and I think Daniel has provided links so you can download it. And I want to jump right in with a short summary of the findings of this paper. We found that in a world in which we want to stand a 50% chance to have less than 2 degrees Celsius warming, we are very likely to have reached the energy capital stock, which will commit us to the emissions that will lead to the 50% chance for 2-degree warming by around 2017, and that is assuming no significant retrofit coal or gas CCS. So this is the main finding of our paper, and the original idea to calculate this date when we will have committed came from basically new science or new scientific findings, which were basically that it's the cumulative amount of carbon emissions we will have emitted over all years by the time we're down to net zero. So it's this cumulative amount that will decide upon peak warming. And there's an inertia in existing infrastructure that already commits us to many years of emissions with infrastructure that is already in operation and built today. So the question was basically very clear after realizing these two things. The question was, if these CCCE, as we call them, the committed cumulative carbon emissions, if they continue to grow as they did over the past decades, when will we have basically committed to 2 degree without any further ado? We checked the sensitivities of our result and found that commitment year has the highest sensitivities towards the assumed lifetime of the underlying infrastructure and also the utilization. So basically assuming that the existing infrastructure will, in quotation marks, only run for 30 instead of 40 years has, of course, a huge impact on the committed emissions. So does assumed utilization going forward. And our remarks or our conclusion for policymakers and investors are basically that given the current status of CCS technology and also the huge investments that are planned over the next couple of years in polluting energy infrastructure, especially coal, investors might actually want to pay a closer attention towards the possibility of stranding of these assets in which they are investing at the moment. So this is a very short summary. Let me now go a little bit further into detail to show you what exactly we found and how we came to these findings. I want to give a very brief introduction, then jump right into the findings. I will not spend a lot of time about the data and the methodology we used for these findings. I will mention it, and if you have further questions, I'm happy to answer these questions. But then I would like to spend a little bit more time on the sensitivities, and in the end, give a brief discussion of our findings and also an outlook for further research. So the first really most important thing to understand, or we needed to understand, was that it is not the emissions in any given year that are relevant for global warming, but it's the cumulative emissions over the entire time of human emitting activity that will eventually decide upon peak warming. What you see here is a graph we took from the IPCC report, and it basically shows for the RCP scenarios the amount of cumulative emissions in 2100 and the years before, and where we will end warming-wise if this amount of emissions will be emitted. And I think really from this slide, what's really most relevant to take away is that it doesn't really matter how much we emit in any given year. It's really how much will we have emitted by the time we finally stop emitting that decides how much warming we will have. We then found a paper from Davis and Sokolov, and this was crucial for our research, because they proposed that instead of accounting for annual emissions, so basically for any given years in the future, give the amount of emissions an asset or an investment will have, it would make more sense to cumulate it and look at it today. What's the remaining amount of cumulative carbon emissions over the entire remaining lifetime of this asset? So that gives you, for any given point in time, the remaining emissions this asset will emit in the future. And this was really very, very important for us to understand and for us to find, to then ask the logical questions, given that I now know that it's going to be cumulative carbon emissions over time, or by the end of emitting activity, that will decide peak warming. And as well, I can calculate for any existing asset, given a couple of assumptions, but I can calculate how much this asset will emit over the remaining lifetime. So yeah, the question was very logical to ask, okay, when will we then have built the installed energy infrastructure capital stock that implies a commitment to 2-degree warming without further investment? So this was really the two most important insights we had from other research that then made us ask this research question. So what did we find? First of all, we did update the remaining total carbon budgets to 2014. So in 2014, depending on the warming objective you choose, you have different amounts of remaining cumulative emissions, CO2, you can emit to stay within this budget. For example, as I show here on the slide, we took all the remaining budgets for less than 1.5 degree warming with a 66% likelihood, up to less than 3 degree warming with a only 33% likelihood, and showed these remaining budgets for 2014. And this is the remaining budget, and the measure is gigatons of carbon here, and not gigatons of CO2. The remaining budget is indeed everything from every sector that we can emit from 2014 on until basically the end of times, in order to stand this chance for this warming. So for 2-degree warming with a 50% likelihood or 50% chance, it's in 2014 323 gigatons of carbon that can be emitted by really everything: power generation, transport, industry, agriculture, etc. And as I already indicate with these sectors, we were only interested in electricity generating infrastructure. So the next step we had to take was to come up with a calculation: what of this total budget remains for only electricity generation. And I apologize in advance that the probably the quality of this graph, at least on my screen, is not optimal. But what you can see here is you see again these 9 blocks. These are again for the warming and likelihood scenarios. And for every block, we took the IPCC scenarios and divided them in 7 categories. And these 7 categories are basically what's the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere by 2100. So you see that 400, so category 1, for example, all the scenarios that fall into category 1 will give us a 450 ppm concentration in the atmosphere in 2100. So roughly speaking, scenarios in category 1 and 2 give us a chance for less than 2 degree warming. All the other categories make it very, very unlikely that we will stay below 2 degree. And what you can then see in this graph is for each of these warming likelihood combinations and categories, what is the remaining generation budget in this scenario in 2014. So I pointed this out for less than 2 degree, 50% chance. If every other sector, so industry, transport, agriculture, etc., follows a pathway that is category 1 consistent, so basically follows a pathway that is consistent with 2 degree based on the IPCC scenarios, then for generation we would have roughly 100 gigatons of carbon left in 2014. I do foresee there's probably a lot of questions towards this step, because this is one of the most important steps in our paper, and I'm not sure if I actually communicated it in a easy way. So I'll just give you the chance to ask a question now. Feel free to raise your hand or write it down in the Q&A. If there are no questions, I will move on. So apparently I made myself clear, so I'm very glad about that. If you have any questions, just let me know. So after calculating how much budget we have left for only power generation, the next question was, okay, how much of this budget did we already commit to with the existing infrastructure? And for that, we took the results from Davis and Sokolov. I mentioned their paper before. It's called Commitment Accounting of CO2 Emissions, and it was published in 2014. And what you see in these 3 graphs, they are copied from their paper, is over time, how many committed emissions did we have, and then they also split it by region and also fossil fuel technology. I think the most important insight from this is that if you assume that these assets have a roughly 40-year lifetime, then in 2014 we had already 90 gigatons of carbon committed with existing infrastructure. So if you bring everything together, we had, before we started to emit carbon in 1870 or so, we had a 3,000 gigatons of CO2. And don't be surprised that the numbers are slightly higher here, because now the measure here is gigatons of CO2. Apologize for that. But we had in 1870 roughly 3,000 gigatons of CO2 to emit for a chance for less than 2 degree warming with a 50% likelihood. Then between 1750 and 2014, we emitted 1,816 of this budget, so that in 2014 we had 1,184 gigatons of CO2 left. That corresponds to the number 323 gigatons of carbon I mentioned before. As I said, the unit here is different, and I just realized this now, so I apologize that I didn't change the units. We then used the IPCC scenarios for 2014 to 2100 to calculate how much of this total remaining budget, it will be consumed by other sectors such as industry and transport and agriculture, and found out that in 2014 we had roughly 380 gigatons of CO2 left for only generating capital structure. That number corresponds, by the way, to the 100 gigatons of carbon I was showing before. We then looked at Davis and Sokolov's paper and found out that of this remaining generation budget, already 90 gigatons of carbon has been committed. So that leaves us in 2014 with only 51 gigatons of CO2 uncommitted remaining energy budget. So the question was now, when will we have committed to these remaining uncommitted emissions? And for that, we took Davis and Sokolov approach and had a look at the past couple of decades of committed emissions growth, and found that over the last couple of decades, committed emissions, so only the amount for any given year that we have already committed to, grew by 4% per year. And that is including taking into account that every year of these committed emissions, some are actually being realized. So that makes this block a bit smaller every year, but so much has been built over the last decades that the pure amount of pure committed emissions has been growing by 4% per year. And now finally, and that's probably the key slide of this presentation, bringing everything together then shows us when we will have committed to this last bit of uncommitted budget. So what you can see, the exponentially growing graphs are committed emissions with different assumed lifetimes. So for example, this graph right here is assuming the lifetime was 60 years. This graph out here is assuming the lifetime was only 20 years. And all of these graphs grow by 4%, which was the average over the last couple of decades. Then the graphs that decrease, these are remaining generation budgets in the respective categories. And as you can already see, and that's what I said in the beginning, only category 1 and category 2 give us a chance for 2 degree. Category 3 is already we are already beyond that. So if we look only at category 1 and category 2 scenarios, then we figure out, and this is our base case, that's the intersect right here, that if the committed emissions continue to grow by 4% per year, then we will have committed to 2 degree in 2017. And that is assuming that all other sectors, so that transport, industry, agriculture, etc., steeply decarbonize. So basically they develop consistent with the 2 degree scenario, which is of course a very optimistic assumption. So even if every other sector in the world decarbonizes very rapidly and develops consistent to 2 degree, even then we will have committed to 2 degree just by the generation capital stock in 2017. If all the other sectors decarbonize slightly slower, that would be category 2, then we probably already have committed to 2 degrees Celsius in 2011. If we, for example, would reduce lifetimes of existing infrastructure from 40 to 30 years, we would gain a little bit more time. So this is how to read this graph. And that's also the main finding of our paper. So again, since this is really the central slide and the most important slide, does anyone have any questions? This doesn't seem to be the case. So then let's move on. How did we come up with sorry, I moved this arrow. So how did we come up with these results? First of all, we used a couple of publicly available and also proprietary databases. I think the most important one, and unfortunately this one is not publicly available, at least not for free, it's actually quite expensive, but this was the Platts World Electric Power Plant database, which contains all electricity power generations worldwide, including a lot of technical data. We then, based on the approach by Davis and Sokolov, we then merged this database with the Karma database, which contains emission data for power plants. We did so because the Platts database doesn't contain, it does contain a lot of technological information, but not how much has been emitted by these generators. So we used the Karma database to get emissions data for these generators. And then we used a couple of other databases, for example, the Global Carbon Project, which contains historical emissions. We used that to update the carbon budgets, and we used the RCP databases and the Assessment Report 5 scenario databases of the IPCC to get pathways for all other sectors for the future. So yeah, we started by updating the carbon budget. So we took the last estimate of the IPCC from 2011 and updated these budgets with the 2011 to 13 data from the global carbon budget. We then estimated the remaining budget only for electricity generation by using the IPCC Assessment Report 5 scenarios. And we also did a lot of checks for scenarios with assumed CCS and without. I'm coming to this in the next section about sensitivities. We then got the resulting remaining budget for electricity production. We then used a forecasting of committed cumulative carbon emissions from generation capital stock based on Davis and Sokolov. They found that in 2012, 304 gigatons of CO2 had been committed to. So we grew that by 4% per year to get the committed emissions in 2014 and beyond. And then finally, we took everything together and came up with the calculation when we will have committed to 2 degrees. So I want to talk briefly about sensitivities. So maybe I go one step back. So obviously there was a little bit of a, let's not call it a flaw, but just assuming that committed emissions grow by 4% per year until the end of times, basically, so in the future, is obviously a very, let's call it a brave assumption. So we were aware of that, and in the beginning we didn't know how to address this. So we wanted to know what are the sensitivities of our results to this assumption. So reason is, if, for example, if every other sector develops consistent to 2 degrees Celsius, then it's probably likely that also electricity generation will have slightly different investment patterns. So maybe in the future committed emissions won't grow by 4% per year, probably much less. It could also be that based on developments in India and China right now, that the committed emissions grow much faster. So looking into this, we assume different growth rates, and you can see this here. Starting in 2014, we assumed growth rates of 0% up to, and now I have to look, I think this is 6% probably. And I had a look how this would change the result. And what we found was very interesting, because we are already on such a high level of committed emissions, and because the remaining budget is so small, even really, really big changes of assumed rates do not change the result significantly. So how this 0% growth rate, you can interpret this, even if in the future we would only replace retired investments. So every time a coal plant shuts down, we build a new one, but we do not expand this capital stock anymore. Even in this case, we would have committed to the remaining budget for generation by 2021. So even this very extreme and, in my opinion, unlikely case would only give us another 4 years at max. And if we assume that the committed emissions grow much faster because suddenly the whole world has this coal renaissance, even then the commitment year would just be slightly, probably a couple of months earlier. So I think the main finding from this is that different growth rates will not change the finding significantly. What we then did was we tried to look at combined sensitivities. So I probably need to explain this a little bit further. So what you see here on the left, 0 to 7, these are different growth rates of CCE. So what you saw on the previous slide, 0 to, then this was probably 7 or 6. That's basically what you also see here, different growth rates of CCE. And then what we did here is, so if you look into category 1 scenarios of the IPCC, then you will not find only one scenario in there, you will find several hundreds in each category. And for our calculations, we usually just took the average of these scenarios. So we said like, okay, for category 1, we just take the average of all scenarios that are in this category and see how our result is. So logically, you see here for 4%, which was our base assumption, and the average of category 1, you get the year 2017, category 2, 2011. This was the finding you saw in the previous graphs. But then, of course, in these categories, you have a lot of different scenarios. Some are, let's call it, on the upper or lower limits of this scenario. So that means there are scenarios that assume that the climate response is a little bit lower than the average scenario in this category, or a little bit higher. So we wanted to know, let's assume we develop, or all sectors develop based consistent to 2 degrees, but then given the climate response, what is the variance of our results? So if the climate response is a little bit higher or lower, how much time would we have? So these are the min-max scenarios. So min gives you basically, this is a scenario with a high climate response. So this basically tells you, well, every sector develops consistent to 2 degrees, but the climate response is pretty high. So if we assume that, we obviously will have relatively low remaining generation emissions. If the climate response is low, we will have a little bit more. So we wanted to know, how does this differ? And as you can see, even these very, very extreme assumptions sometimes do not differ that result on the min side a lot. So basically, if the climate response is very high and the future capital stock develops with a 7% per year, then we will have committed in 2006 already. So that's in the past. If the climate response is low and we only replace retired infrastructure, then we'll have maybe until 2033. So again, I hope I made myself clear, but feel free to just ask if you have any questions. And the final sensitivity we checked, and this is basically again the graph you saw before, that was regarding the lifetimes. The lifetimes have a huge effect because it just makes a huge effect on committed emissions if you assume that this power plant will emit over the next 20 or 30 years. So reducing lifetimes of existing and future capital stock could reduce committed emissions quite significantly. And we have the example here, cutting lifetimes by halves, for example, from 40, which is the fat black graph here, to 20 years, which is the graph on the right, would buy us approximately from 2017 to 2031, so around 15 years time. So we found the highest sensitivity is indeed towards the lifetimes of polluting infrastructure. And that also already brings us to the discussion and the outlook. And I think I stayed well within my 30 minutes. So I think the first really clear finding is that if we take the 2 degrees Celsius goal serious, an assets trending is very likely. In our calculations, we did not assume there will be significant carbon dioxide removal technology, and by that I mean technology that either sucks carbon out of the air and hence creates new budget, or technology that can be retrofit to existing infrastructure and captures the carbon there, because that will reduce committed emissions from the capital stock. So we did not assume any of these things happening over the coming decades. And under this assumption, we will very, very likely commit to 2 degrees in 2017. And if we really take 2 degrees Celsius serious, we need to retire much of this, quite a lot of this capital stock in the future. And that can be capital stock that already exists today, or that can be capital stock that is yet to be built. The second and very interesting finding, as I find, is that this much promoted coal to gas switching might not be so helpful. And the reason for this is simple. Much of the existing coal generators have already been running for a couple of years and have only limited remaining lifetime. If I shut down these coal generators and replace them with new gas generators, then these have another 40 years of lifetime. So if I compare the committed emissions of both options, it might be that this doesn't really change the committed emissions significantly. And I have on the next slides, I have a short outlook to research we are currently doing, so I can go further into that. And the last thing is that we need a big push on the polluting energy infrastructure, simply for the reason we can retire existing infrastructure that will buy us time before we have to go down or before we have to get to net zero. But the big question remains, with what are we going to replace these generators? We cannot just shut down coal and gas right now and don't replace it with something else, because we need the electricity, we need the power. So this was basically so far the paper I wanted to present. I just want to give you a very, very brief outlook what we are currently doing, and I just want to send a little disclaimer. The next 3 slides I'm going to show are not published, are not peer reviewed. This is literally fresh science, fresh research what we are at the moment doing, and I'm very happy to get your feedback on this, but this is really nothing peer reviewed. So if we look in the future and we look at a lot of different scenarios, we see that even though as I just showed, we should probably stop investing in polluting infrastructure in 2017. Almost every scenario, be it BP, IEA, etc., assumes significant coal and gas. I have it here: coal and gas investments over the next 10 to 15 years. And I was wondering, well, what would happen if we do not? So we take these scenarios with regards to energy demand and with regards to utilization rates, etc., and then just assume that instead of building coal, we just build gas. And what you see here in this graph is basically these are committed emissions from coal, gas, and the little blue spot is oil. And up here, that's the remaining generation budget. And as we can see, even if I build in the future, like all the new capacity I build in the future is only gas, so no more coal, no more oil, then still we will have committed to the budget some time in the mid-2020s. And the reason for this is that I still have a lot of coal that will emit over the next couple of years. So even in 2055, I still have a little bit of coal left in the system, and gas also emits. So we will have, even if in a new gas only scenario, we would have probably committed to the remaining budget quite soon. And the next question I was asking, that's what I mentioned before: what would happen? Just assume we retire all coal overnight and replace, because we still need that power generation capacity, we just replace all coal by gas. You can see that here. So overnight, all the coal committed emissions go to zero, all the oil emissions go to zero. I also assume we replace oil, and I suddenly only have emissions from gas. However, what we can see, and that's what I mentioned before, the dent here is not that big. And the reason is I take out all the coal, but I replace it with new gas. So the committed emissions from this new gas almost make up all the difference, all the benefits I get from the higher carbon efficiency from gas. So even then, we will have emitted somewhat. I cannot read it on my paper. I think that's in the late 2020s. So an immediate stranding of all coal and oil and replacing it with gas wouldn't really buy us much time. What it would do, however, and that's the last slide I want to show, and again, this is really not peer reviewed, so please take it as granted here. But I just took some IEA cost estimates and the respective utility rates, and I said, well, we replace all coal, so all the 2.2 2,200 gigawatt of coal in the global system, and we replace it by the respective amount of gas. That would cost roughly 2.6% of 2014 global GDP, and as I showed before, wouldn't really buy us much more time. So this is as far as I want to go in my presentation. I'm very happy to answer your questions now and take your feedback, and thank you very much for your attention.